How's it going, guys? Hope you're having a wonderful day. This is Advanced Music Theory video number 2. So we're going to talk today about chord borrowing from the modes or like a parallel key as you're going. So let's discuss first what kind of the idea behind this is. And we'll start in my favorite key, G. So, G major. This G major chord. It exists in more than one key. It's the one chord of G, right? But it's the 4 chord of D, and it's the 5 chord of C. Well, that means that automatically from that D chord, all the chords of those other 2 keys can be on the table in a way. Now, what I mean is you can borrow from them. Now, if you say go to an A major chord and then you go up to the D and then you hang out in the key of D, you didn't do any kind of parallel borrowing. You just went to that key. Whereas, say you're doing like, let's say you're going 1, 2, 5. So normally 1 would be G, 2 is A, 5 is D. Well, you could borrow the A from D. And now, and then put your brain back into G major mode. So now, you're playing in G major, but you have 4 major chords instead of 3 like usual because you're just parallel borrowing. Now, in the same kind of idea, you could borrow from each mode or switch gears into each mode and then come back out of it. What do I mean by that? Well, the G major chord with a major 7th. Once you add the 7th, it changes things a little bit. But we know that this G7 chord, this could either be 1 or it could be 4. Well, as we discussed way earlier on in like the modes videos and stuff, well, the 4 chord of, if you're thinking of this as Lydian, is this chord. And then you would go to this chord, then you would come back. Whereas in major, you'd go from this chord to this chord to your dominant. Well, now, if you parallel borrow, you can take your G. You know what? I'm going to throw that in as my 4 this time around. Then you're back to G. And you just carry on like nothing ever happened. Or, let's say you want to do like put the 2 in there before you go to the 4 chord. So we're gonna borrow the 2 chord, which in this case we're still thinking like Lydian for a second. We're in G major, but we're gonna parallel borrow from Lydian. So for a second, we have to think, okay, now we're Lydian, and then we'll get out of it. Well, what's the 2 chord in Lydian? The dominant chord. We'll go to that 4 chord of Lydian, up to the dominant, and then we'll carry on in G major like nothing happened. You can do stuff like that if you borrow in a parallel fashion. Parallel meaning that whatever, you're centered on G, so anything that has to do with G, you can borrow from it briefly. So let's stick with this G major, G Lydian for a second, and then I'll give you another example. Okay, so we're in G major. That's that 4 chord from G major. There's that 5 chord from G major. Now for a second, G Lydian. All that tension second, we borrow from G Lydian. Now, what's interesting, this chord wants to go to this chord. But we don't do that, do we? No, we don't. We go from this chord to our diminished chord from Lydian, and then resolve to the 5 chord of G major. So for 2 chords, we were thinking, alright, we're Lydian for a second. Back to major, because we're back to that dominant. Then we're back home. So that's what's cool about this parallel borrowing. You know, we discussed like common tone chords before. Now we're doing like common scale, I guess, you know, because it's G. G Lydian is still a major mode. G Mixolydian's a major mode. So you can borrow from them. But also, you can briefly borrow from the minor modes. Well, what exactly would that be like? Okay, so here's G, G normal. What we're going to call it, G major, G normal. But what happens if we then go to G Dorian? Huh. Now we've got this for our 1. Now our 4 chord is this guy. The dominant moved over there. And then we're going to go up to our actual dominant, back to G normal. Let's check that out. Okay, G major, G normal, dominant. Now we're going to go to G Dorian. Back to G major. It's kind of cool. So that's the door we're currently walking through now, is being able to steal basically from everywhere however we want. And it starts to really get complicated. So I might make a few videos that are still this same concept, but just showing you different examples. Because this time we did Lydian and G major, and then we did G major to G Dorian. I'm trying to remember what I just did a few minutes ago. That's awesome. But yeah, not the point. The point is, I'll come up with examples and do a few different videos where we're going to parallel borrow and maybe even do some weird reaching, or maybe add some secondary chords in the midst of our borrowing and really dissect, like, how weird can this get. For example, you got your Dorian. Then we did this, but what if you put a secondary diminished and then go to dominant and then back to 1? You get a lot of tension built up in there, right? Or we're in G major. Let's flip to Dorian on the next measure. Stay in Dorian a second. Secondary diminished. 5 of G major. Back to G major. So you could always drop that quality halfway through and then continue like it's G major. Or continue like it's G Dorian. It's pretty cool. You have all these options now. You sorry. I lost my brain there for a second. You could even go like it's Phrygian. So now you went from here, because you're thinking 4 and 5 are Phrygian, back to G major. Why? Because it was all based off that G. Sorry, I'm getting a cold. Not feeling super awesome. I'm still trying to make this as fun as humanly possible. But anyhow, that's probably enough examples for one day. I see we're coming up on the 10-minute mark. I'm trying to keep these videos like 10 minutes-ish, because I don't want... it's more so that if you pack too much information into one video, I worry that maybe people won't be able to absorb it, or won't feel like they have time to really like memorize it and be able to practice it, because, you know, I covered like 7 things. They're like, good God, you know, how am I going to whittle all that down? So I'll come back at you in a few more videos with some more examples of this stuff, so we can start like really kind of reaching out into the woods and see what we can grab and see if we can find some cool chord progressions. Have a good day. You're doing awesome. Thank you so much for watching, whoever does. I really do appreciate that.